I'm sure many of us have heard the common phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is the perfect quote to introduce the idea of visual aids. Visual aids are a huge part of any successful presentation. And it's something that I try to incorporate in my teaching as well. You may notice throughout the semester that I use similar colors, similar fonts, and a similar style of design of my PowerPoints as well as my syllabus. And this is all for an intentional purpose because pictures and images have a really powerful effect when you are communicating with people. Now, you may notice that there is a visual aid requirement for your informative and persuasive speeches. So today we want to talk about why we use visual aids in presentations and how we can use visual aids in our presentations. So let's start out with the why of visual aids. Digital Splash Media does these great short 30-second videos, and one of their videos explains the picture superiority effect. Basically, the picture superiority effect is explaining why images are a powerful tool in communicating with an audience. When the audience is just presented with text, such as the word circle, 3 days later, they're likely to remember 10% of that information. However, if you combine an image, such as the orange circle you see here, with the actual text of the word circle, it increases the audience's likelihood of remembering 65% of that information 3 days later. So the combination of text and images can increase the audience's understanding and recall. Now let's take a look at the 30-second video that Digital Splash Media put together to explain this phenomenon. So the basic statistic that they were trying to get us to remember is that when we hear information or view text, we're likely to remember 10% of that information 3 days later. However, if we combined words and pictures, that increases to 65% 3 days later. And so they used images and pictures to communicate this to us in several different ways. First, you can see we have the two parties, the sender and the receiver, and we hear some information, and look over here on the right side, we see this little 1 number up here on the calendar. Now the calendar all of a sudden changed to the number 4, so automatically our mind is thinking, oh, 3 days later. But then we also see that text 3 days later. And also we see the 10% nice and big here, but if you take a look at our little stick figure, you also see that just 10% is highlighted in her brain. So we're seeing the combination of words and images right here in this short video. Now, to explain how words and pictures work together, we see this same thing. We add a picture, you see the little 1 there in the calendar. And now we see that 3 days later, again, our calendar number changed with the text of the 3 days. We have the 65% statistic nice and big, as well as the pie chart 65% represented in our receiver's brain. And then they give that information to us one more time with a simple bar chart. And you see the 10% compared to the 65%. And you see that represented in the larger bar, but also the repetition of the percentage numbers. And so again, this is another way to communicate the information to us. You guys can use this same thing in your speeches. Don't just give a statistic or give a piece of information and blow right past it. Show it to the audience several different ways to really increase their understanding of that material. So now that we understand how pictures can really add to the audience's understanding of our message, let's talk about how we can use visual aids in our speeches. Our ideal software for our visual aids will be the use of PowerPoint, and I have 3 simple tips for you guys. First, avoid any bullets. You might recall from an earlier TED Talk video with Melissa Marshall that bullets can kill your presentation. That's because it relies too much on the language processing part of our brain. And when we are reading that information, we're not really listening to the words of the speaker. Just like when you're in a class, if you see a bunch of bullets on a slide, you're going to immediately start copying down all that information, and you are missing out on everything that the speaker is saying. Also, with PowerPoint, you can use a lot of clip art and fancy word art and animations and all that type of stuff, and it really can detract from your speech. The idea is to really keep it simple here. So avoid any clip art and avoid any weird transitions or animations. And lastly, avoid any really confusing charts. You can make all kinds of crazy images and crazy charts on PowerPoint, but really, if it's too hard for the audience to understand, they're not going to remember it. Look back at the video that we just watched. That 10% versus 65% bar graph was really easy for you guys to understand. Here's just a really simple example of how you can take a boring slide and turn it into a really effective image that is going to match what you're saying. This is just a sample slide from the Junior League of Greater Orlando, and in their previous PowerPoint, they listed a whole bunch of programs bulleted in their presentation, and they decided that the audience really wasn't getting the impact of all the great work that they were doing. So instead, they just chose 2 of their most effective programs and highlighted that in their presentation. So the Crisis Nursery and the Discovery Room at the Orlando Science Center. Now, 2 things here on these 2 slides to your right. You see that they have one nice big picture. That's a really good idea for any of your slides. Just one big picture that represents what you're talking about, and then just a little bit of text. Now, the speaker would probably want to incorporate with this slide a story or a testimonial of, say, a child helped out by the Crisis Nursery, or a class that's being held at the Discovery Room at the Orlando Science Center. That would be a good way of combining the text with the images. And 4 very simple design tips for you guys. Number 1, if you're going to use any images at all, you need to make sure that you have a license to use them. So do not use Google Images and just steal an image from the web. That technically is plagiarism, and you're technically using a copyright for an image that you don't own. So one great source is to go to compfight.com. Now I'm going to show you guys how to use that site. Compfight.com is a great source to find Creative Commons license images that you can use in any of your PowerPoints. So I'm going to simply type in classroom here into my search area. But before you go any further, you want to click on Creative Commons. So that is going to only give you images that you have the Creative Commons right to use. Let's take a look at this image here of a classroom, and you can see that I have some options for how big I want the image to be. I would recommend the large size for any PowerPoint. You simply click download and you can use that image in your PowerPoints however you wish. Again, don't use any of these that are up here under the professional stock photos section. The images that are free for you to use always have this little blue bar at the bottom. Another good design tip is to always cite your information at the bottom of the page. So if it's a statistic or a quote, or it's any example or any type of fact that comes from a source, it's a good idea to cite that information very, very small, probably about 12 or 14 point font at the bottom right corner of your page. Another tip is to keep things very simple and clear. This refers to the amount of text that you use, the type of font you use, as well as the colors that you use. When you are using any fonts, you want to make sure they are a sans serif font. Basically, that means that all of your letters don't have that little tail here. So if you were using Times New Roman, the font has little tails at the end of the letters, whereas a sans serif font means without those tails. It's easier for the audience to read from a distance. Good sans serif fonts are fonts like Arial or Helvetica, Calibri, or Century Gothic, which is the font that I use in all of my PowerPoints. You also want to use a large enough font so that the audience can see it from far away. I really recommend about 28-point font or higher. With your colors, make sure that they are high contrast. So you'll notice that I mostly use a white background with very dark fonts. That allows for a very high or sharp contrast from the background to the color of the text. That will allow the audience to read it from very far away. It's also a good idea to keep your colors limited to just a couple of colors. You'll notice that I mostly use orange, gray, and a turquoise color. Keep things very clear. That means very uncluttered. White space is a good thing. If you're using images, only use one image per slide. That will really allow the audience to see this big image that you're using. You can also use circles or arrows to point to key information that you want the audience to key into. And lastly, when you're delivering your visual aids, you want to use the conceal, reveal, conceal rule. So that means that you don't want any slides up when you're not currently talking about them. That's because anything on the screen is going to distract the audience from what you're currently saying. So in your PowerPoints, you can simply put a blank white slide before and after each of your information slides. So that way you have a blank slide on your screen, and when you're ready to reveal your information, you click the button to reveal the slide, you talk about it, and then when you're done with that visual aid, you'll click the slide again to advance to that blank background so that again the audience can focus on your words and not what is on the screen at this time. So we've talked about both the why of visual aids and the how of visual aids, and we see that combining images with our words will increase the audience's ability to recall the information in our speeches. It also gives you a lot of dynamism and energy when you have good solid visual aids. And like that old saying, a picture is indeed worth 1,000 words.